January 1993. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're trapped in a box about the size of a small car with two other people. The box is surrounded by hardened concrete and you're running out of air. Rescue is on its way, but the air won't last long enough to keep three people alive. What would you do? I know what I would do because at a certain point in 1954, that was the situation I found myself in. I also know what Professor Roy Taylor would have done, because he was there too, and he did not exactly acquit himself with honour. The early 1950s were an absolute whirlwind for me. I was exempt from national service due to my status as a student, and upon graduating I began postgraduate research at Manchester, working towards a doctorate. I was absolutely overjoyed to be assigned Professor Roy Taylor as my supervisor. Taylor was an expert on quantum theory and was developing a new theory of quantum resonances. Around the time that I graduated, I fell in love with the girl of my dreams, and a year later, Mary and I were married in a small ceremony in a village church. The year following our marriage was a wonderful year for both of us. We were able to buy a small house with some assistance from our families. Mary was keen on having at least 3 children, and that suited me very well. I saw my future self as a professor of physics, the father of a substantial brood, with my loving wife at my side. There seemed to be no obstacles in our way, and I believe I was just about the happiest man alive. In 1954, Professor Taylor was awarded the prestigious Cavendish Prize, which in physics is second only to a Nobel. Due to the prize, he probably became the 4th or 5th most famous physicist in the whole world, and I was his apprentice. The Institute was in the process of laying the foundations of an entirely new modernist building at the time, which was intended to be completely devoted to physics. After Taylor won the prize, it was decided that the new building would be entirely under Taylor's supervision. There was every chance that I would become the second most important in the new department eventually, as Taylor's assistant and protege. I thought I would probably make assistant professor before I turned 30. There was only one small fly in the ointment, and that was a fellow by the name of Trelling. Peter Trelling was a massive oaf of a man whom I strongly suspected had obtained his doctorate via scientific fraud. But for some reason Taylor seemed fond of him, and it wasn't impossible that he might make assistant professor before me. He avoided being thrown out on his ear only by constantly flattering Taylor. The man was so lazy and obtuse that I felt fairly sure that I would be the first in line for any assistant professorship, in spite of Trelling's seniority and dog-like adoration of Taylor. They say pride comes before a fall, and I was certainly proud. It was then that tragedy struck. Mary began to gradually waste away. She steadily lost weight, and her cheeks became pale and hollow. Instead of the good news that we were hoping for, instead of looking forward to the birth of our first child, the doctors gave us terrible news. Mary's condition, they said, was incurable and would probably eventually kill her. They said the wasting would most likely continue and eventually it would finish her off. For a while, I underwent some sort of mental collapse. I couldn't focus on anything, and I only wanted to find a way to help my wife. It was Mary who told me to do what I found inconceivable and pull myself together. I want things to be as normal as possible, she said. Get on with your research. The doctors might be wrong, and even if they aren't, it might be years before She burst into tears, but then quickly regained control of herself. Oscar Archibald Hughes, she said determinedly. You are going to pull your socks up, be a man and make me proud of you. Go back to the Institute tomorrow and tell the professor you're all better. I did as she told me, and I found that by focusing intensely on the research, I could push all other thoughts temporarily to the back of my mind and find a sort of comfort for some hours, which neither religion nor stiff drink had been able to give me. Oscar, I heard about your wife. Taylor said, back at the lab. It's a terrible thing. However, we all have problems, and one must never allow personal difficulties to get in the way of science. We are men of science, you and I, Hughes. Men of science must never be distracted by personal entanglements. Science demands our complete dedication. I was a little put out to hear my wife described as an entanglement, but I simply said, "Yes, of course you're right, Professor. In any case, it's Mary's wish that I continue to devote myself to the research, and that's what I intend to do." "Good lad," said Taylor. It was about 6 months after the diagnosis that Professor Taylor came to me with a bizarre theory of his. We had been attempting to find an explanation for certain odd spectral lines in light emitted by amethyst crystal under particular conditions of temperature and pressure. It turned out that while I had been trying to make modest adjustments to existing theories to account for the lines, Taylor had practically constructed a whole new physics which elegantly accommodated them. His theory was complex and heavily mathematical, and there were parts of it that had deep philosophical implications that I couldn't entirely grasp. But I must attempt to at least give the flavour of it here, because it's essential to the story that I have to tell you. Taylor argued that the universe we inhabit is not a single thing, but a complex manifold where everything that can happen does happen. That is, there are an infinite number of parallel universes rolled into one. He believed that only certain of these parallel manifolds are inhabited with consciousness, perhaps even only one of them. Many are purely material worlds where no thought or feeling exists. In his theory, consciousness performs a key function in deciding what actually happens in the most definite kind of a way. In other universes, events may in a sense occur, but they are observed by nothing and no one, so they may as well not have happened at all, but for their wraith-like effects on our own version of reality, manifest in various obscure physical phenomena. The theory also involved radical revisions to certain common ideas. Taylor held that consciousness was relative somehow, and that objective facts are really only subjective. A thing that was true in one person's universe might not be true in someone else's. It was pretty rich stuff, and I don't pretend to have understood it all, but the real core of it wasn't these philosophical interpretations of it, but rather a mathematical theory that dealt only with hard numbers. The theory perfectly explained the spectral lines we were observing at the mathematical level. I found that very impressive by itself. It's fair to say that I didn't immediately grasp the full import of the theory, but Taylor certainly did. "If I'm right," said Taylor to me at the lab one day, "it ought to be possible to set a macroscopic object in resonance with certain homologous manifolds, thus transferring the object from one manifold to another." Taylor had a habit of speaking in language that really made little sense even to our fellow physicists, but I grasped his meaning well enough. "You're saying we might transfer an object from our universe to another parallel universe?" "Precisely," he said. "I call the process resonant transfer. Of course, there would be no real point in doing so, since the other universe, as you put it, would have to be very similar to ours in order to establish resonance. In particular, the object to be transferred would have to already exist there." "In effect, we would have achieved exactly nothing," I suggested. "You're quite right," he said. Except, you see, if people were transferred, they might retain the consciousness of the universe they'd come from, our universe. They would simply shift from a universe almost identical to their own, ours, but most likely with a few key facts changed." "Theoretically speaking, of course," I said. "I mean, we're not actually going to be able to try it." "I think we might," he said, a strange light appearing in his eyes. "I think we might build a kind of chamber that could actually transfer one or more people from this universe to a parallel universe. Since the reverse trip would only involve setting up a converse resonance, I think we might bring them back again too." He looked at me out of the corner of his eye, like a naughty schoolboy suggesting a prank to another schoolboy. He also rather reminded me of my aunt whenever she considered the matter of indulging in an ice cream. "What, really?" I said. "Really," he said. "If I were to attempt to design such a chamber, might I count on your assistance?" "You certainly might," I said. We spent the next 4 or 5 months building a chamber along the lines suggested by Taylor's theories. Trelling also contributed minimally, although to hear him talk you'd almost think the entire thing was his work alone. The university authorities consistently opposed our efforts regarding the project as dubious and bordering on pseudoscientific, but they didn't dare oppose a Cavendish Prize winner. Taylor's prestige by that time was so great that if all the other physicists at the institute had denounced him, and if he had in turn denounced them, he and not they would likely have carried the day in the eyes of the general public and the various grant-awarding bodies. Had it not been for these factors, I am sure the Institute administration would have nipped all talk of parallel universes in the bud and cut Taylor's funding drastically. As it was, they had little alternative but to allow us to get on with it. By the time we'd finished, we had a thing that looked not unlike a giant washing machine. A curved steel chamber about 6 feet high with a powerfully built glass and steel door on enormous hinges. A strong door was necessary to fully seal off the outer world during the period when a transfer was occurring. The chamber was big enough for 2 people or even 4 with a bit of a squeeze. My idea had always been that specially trained people would volunteer to be sent through the chamber to the alternate universe, pilots perhaps, or deep-sea divers. People who were used to that kind of thing. It turned out that Taylor had an entirely different idea. He felt we ought to go in it ourselves. "What training could possibly prepare anyone for a parallel universe?" he said, and I suppose he had a point. Nevertheless, at first I flatly refused the idea. My mind changed when I made the mistake of discussing the matter with Mary. Her face positively lit up, even though the ravages of her illness increasingly showed in her pale features. "You'll be the first ever traveller to another dimension," she said. "Well, along with the professor," I said. "My husband, the world's first interdimensional traveller." "There might be some risk involved, my love," I said. "No one's ever tried it before." "But you're brave," she exclaimed, her eyes shining. "Everyone will see how brave you are. Imagine. It'll be in all the papers." "I suppose," I said doubtfully. "You have to do it, Oscar. You are going to do it, aren't you?" I couldn't very well say no after all that. "Of course," I said. "It must be done, for the sake of science and human progress." A few days later, Taylor announced that Trelling would be coming with us in the chamber. I can't say I was pleased, but I had half suspected Taylor would want his faithful hound with him on any interdimensional journey, so I wasn't altogether surprised. The date for the journey was set for August, only 2 weeks after the chamber had been completed. When the day arrived, the weather turned out to be beautifully sunny. Not that it really mattered for our purposes, and I was in high spirits, if a little apprehensive. The idea was that we would transfer ourselves to a parallel reality, make certain experimental observations in the new reality over the course of about 10 hours, then travel back again. "Remember," said Taylor, as the 3 of us stood assembled outside the chamber, "on no account must we leave the laboratory after the resonant transfer has taken place. The world outside the lab may be significantly different to the one with which we are familiar. At this stage we will only undertake observations to verify that the experiment has succeeded before returning to the present continuum." "You hear that, Hughes?" said Trelling. "No wandering off when we're in the parallel universe." "I think I can contain myself," I said. "You better," said Trelling. "This is a serious business." "Let us enter the chamber," said Taylor. "Hughes, open the door, please." I hoisted the door open and we stepped into the chamber. Once the door was shut, Taylor began to make some adjustments to the settings with a screwdriver via a series of small screw-head potentiometers, Trelling holding a flashlight so he could better see what he was doing. "Whatever parallel reality we land in," he said, "the only thing we can be absolutely certain of is that the chamber will exist in it. However, I'm maximising the resonance settings to ensure our new universe will remain as similar as possible to our present universe, with only minimal differences. I hope they have beer in the new universe, said Trelling. I hope they have oxygen, said Taylor. When he'd finished, we sat down on a pair of narrow metal benches that were installed either side of the chamber, myself on one side and Taylor and Trelling on the other. Finally, Trelling said, "A posse ad esse," which apparently means from possibility to actuality or something like that, and he flicked the switch to activate the machine. I knew something had changed immediately, but I could not immediately say what it was. Then I realised that the glass door had gone dark. "Gentlemen," said Taylor solemnly, "we are about to make history. Open the door, Hughes." I pulled the lever down that opened the door, but the door wouldn't open, not even a fraction of an inch. It was jammed fast. "Something's blocking it," I said. Trelling shone his flashlight through the door. "Looks like concrete," he said, turning pale. "We've materialised inside a block of stone or something," I said, my pulse quickening. "Nonsense," said Taylor. "That's quite impossible. In what world does this chamber exist inside a block of stone?" None of us had any answer to that, but the fact is that the door resisted all efforts to open it, and as far as we could see, Trelling was correct. The material on the other side of the door really looked like concrete, as if we'd been dropped into a huge pit of the stuff and left there till it set. We tried tapping around the sides of the chamber, and everywhere we heard the same dull sound, as if the chamber was entirely encased in stone. The sound was quite unlike the ringing sound the chamber had previously made when struck. "We need to transport ourselves back again," said Trelling, sounding rather panicky. "We can't," said Taylor. "The resonance calculations," I said. "Exactly," said Taylor. "The what?" said Trelling. "We have to make precise calculations in order to be able to return," I said. "They take at least 3 hours." "Well, what are we going to do?" said Trelling. "I don't want to die stuck inside a block of ruddy cement." "We can transfer somewhere else," said Taylor thoughtfully. "We must have had spectacularly bad luck to end up here. Out of all the possible universes in which this chamber exists, perhaps only a minute fraction of them have the chamber encased in concrete. The odds are overwhelmingly against us ending up in one of those universes on any particular transfer. Our next journey will almost certainly result in livable conditions." "Let's go then," said Trelling. "I'm getting the shivers in here." Taylor paused, as though about to broach a delicate matter. When he spoke, I could hear the dryness of his mouth. "The capacitors take 2 hours to charge," he said. "With 3 of us in here, the carbon dioxide concentration of the air will almost certainly have built up to lethal levels by then." He immediately turned and began adjusting the potentiometers and activating the charging circuits. "Well, what does that mean then?" said Trelling wildly, addressing his question to Taylor's back. "We're going to die." "2 of us could survive long enough," said Taylor over his shoulder. He turned round and faced us soberly. "It's a simple calculation," he continued. "I must remain alive for the sake of science. One of you must die to save the rest of us." "Now hang on a minute," I said. "I'm afraid you have very little chance of overcoming Peter in a fight," Taylor said to me. "Therefore Peter and I shall have to terminate your vital processes, I'm afraid, Oscar." Taylor and Trelling fixed their eyes on me in a manner I can only describe as predatory. Can we just talk about this?" I stammered. "That would only generate further carbon dioxide," said Taylor. Then, turning to Trelling, he said, "Immobilise him, please, Peter. I shall insert the screwdriver into the jugular. Don't worry, Oscar. It will be largely painless." Trelling, that lumbering oaf, yanked me forwards and grabbed my arms. I was frozen in terror. Trelling began to raise the screwdriver up to my neck, carefully positioning it. When it was in place, he raised his other hand, clearly intending to hammer the screwdriver into my neck with his palm. "Please, let's talk about this," I shouted. It was only at the very last moment that I comprehended that unless I took swift action, I was about to die. I twisted my body with all my strength, just as Taylor hit the screwdriver, and instead of penetrating my neck, it scratched a line along the side of my neck and plunged into Trelling's neck. Trelling let go of me and fell back. For a moment I thought he was only mildly injured. The screwdriver was stuck in his neck, but it wasn't clear that it had hit anything vital, and it hadn't gone very deep. Then it fell to the floor, and a huge torrent of blood positively spurted out of him. He tried to stem it with his hands, making horrible gurgling noises, but then he fainted, and his blood slowly began to fill the whole of the chamber floor. Taylor was looking at me with an expression of shock on his face. Perhaps he was afraid of what I might do. He had miscalculated badly, and he knew it. Then he seemed to get his face under control and almost smiled. He bent down to pick up the screwdriver and began wiping off some of the blood with his handkerchief. "Well, that solves that problem," he said. "You were going to kill me," I exclaimed. "Yes," he said. "It's nothing personal, I hope you know that." "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said. "We're scientists, not murderers." "Better one dead person than 3, he said. "Sometimes one has to make difficult decisions." With that, he suddenly lunged at me again with the screwdriver, but I managed to intercept his hand and caught his wrist. Now, the look on his face was absolutely unhinged. "You lied to him, didn't you?" I said, between gritted teeth. "There's only enough air for one person." He tried to force the screwdriver into my neck, but he was old and no match for me. I threw him to the ground and placed my knee on his back. "Don't try to get up," I said. "You fool," he said. "We'll both die." "We'll see," I replied. The fact is, Taylor had no special expertise in human respiration. I had little faith in his calculations. I managed to tie him up pretty thoroughly by tearing my jacket into strips and using his own tie. Then I sat on the bench and tried to slow my breathing. "You know, if we survive," said Taylor from his position on the floor in a pool of Trelling's blood, "I'll tell them you killed Trelling in a fit of manic rage." "Shut it," I said curtly. "We need to conserve oxygen." "Who will they believe?" said Taylor. "You, a junior research assistant, or me, a recipient of the Cavendish Prize?" I didn't bother replying to the old fool. Instead, we sat there in silence, waiting. After an hour, the air was extremely stuffy and I had a headache. Taylor looked like he was half asleep. I began to worry that I would pass out. Then either Taylor would murder me, or else neither of us would be in a fit state to press the transfer switch when the time came to get ourselves out of there. The capacitor charge light remained stubbornly dimmed. I fixed my gaze on it and tried to push all thoughts out of my head, other than the thought that I had to push that button when that light illuminated. It seemed to me more than likely that thinking would only metabolize more oxygen and hasten our end. Besides, I was fighting off a bad case of panic. The next hour seemed to pass incredibly slowly. Strange, distorted images began to flicker in my mind, and at times I fancied I was at home in my bed, waking from some strange dream. Only very slowly did the awareness that the charge light was on filter through to my oxygen-depleted brain. How long it had been on for, I didn't know. What it meant, I wasn't sure, but I knew it meant something important. The memory returned to me all at once, and I flung my hand at the transfer button. The dark concrete obscuring the view through the door disappeared instantly, and I saw our old familiar laboratory once more. I threw myself bodily on the door handle and managed to get it open. Then I stumbled out, more than half dead, into the laboratory. Not until I'd sat breathing in fresh air for a good 5 minutes did I think to check on Taylor. He was conscious but seemed very dazed. I untied him and dragged him out of the chamber, leaving a wide trail of blood on the floor. Then I staggered to the door and shouted for help. Professor Andrews, our somewhat eccentric and temperamental head of department, was the first person to turn up. "My God," he said, observing the chaos. "What the hell happened here?" "He killed Peter and tried to kill me," said Taylor. "No, he tried to kill me and killed Peter by mistake," I said. "You useless devil, Taylor," said Andrews. "I'm going to bury your machine as soon as the police have finished with you." Taylor gawped at him, unused to being spoken to in such a manner. I probably gawped a bit myself. "How dare you speak to me like that?" said Taylor angrily, attempting to rise to his feet and then sitting down on the floor heavily again. "I'm a Cavendish Prize winner." "If you're a Cavendish Prize winner, I'm a jolly mermaid," snorted Andrews sarcastically. That was the first indication we had that the parallel universe into which we had transported was significantly different to the one we'd left. Taylor spent 2 days recovering in hospital, after which he was taken into police custody. There was never any question of who had killed Trelling. Apart from anything else, Taylor's bloody handprints were all over the murder weapon. It transpired that, in this universe, Taylor had not in fact won any Cavendish Prize. He was in fact regarded as a crank who had become increasingly erratic and was wasting the time of promising graduates such as myself. Andrews was as good as his word and had Taylor's machine buried in the foundations of the new building. I can only surmise that, in the universe to which we had initially transported, this had happened slightly earlier, so the machine was already buried by the time the resonant transfer swapped our machine for the buried version. The biggest surprise awaited me back at home. When I entered my house, still covered in Trelling's blood, Mary greeted me enthusiastically and asked me how the experiment had gone, her expression turning to concern as she noted the condition of my attire. To my astonishment, she was the absolute picture of health. In the parallel universe in which I was now permanently stuck, Mary had never fallen ill in the first place and was expecting our first child. Of course, I have been left with many questions. As time went by, I seemed to, one might say, recover memories appropriate to my new universe, so that the previous version of my life became more like a vague and distant memory or dream to me. I have since felt completely at home in this new universe. I often wonder about the universe I left. Is there somewhere a Mary that is still ill and has perhaps now died? Did the version of myself that was born and lived in this universe end up in the parallel reality that I left? For he entered the chamber in this universe and would never have been able to return, since the presence of myself, Taylor and Trelling's corpse in this version of reality would have disrupted the required mode of resonance, as far as I understand it. Even worse than that, could my past self from the present universe have transported back here, somehow, only to find himself trapped under the concrete? If I understand Taylor's theory well enough, there is effectively only one universe inhabited by conscious beings, and that would imply that our transfer between parallel realities permanently changed even Mary's own past. And that's a comforting idea to me, because it means there is no alternate reality in which Mary is ill or dead, at least not any truly meaningful reality. Unfortunately, I can't really put these questions to Taylor because he was declared criminally insane and incarcerated in a facility designed for such people, where I'm told he has to be kept heavily sedated for his own good. Mary and I went on to have a total of 4 fine children, and I made assistant professor by the age of 31, which I was very pleased with. As for the resonant transfer technology that we built, it's still under the Andrews Physics Lab of the Manchester Institute of Advanced Studies, and I think that's where it should stay. Thank you for listening. This is Science Horror, and my name is John. New episodes every Monday. If you feel at all predisposed towards giving the video a like and subscribing, that would be wonderful. Until next time, sleep well.